Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second annual Mount Tam Integration Jam. I am your host, Daniel Schenken. I'm very, very glad that you're here to join us as we celebrate good psychedelic practice from beginning to end, even though it never ends. And today we have the Spiritual Emergency panel. Before I introduce our guests, I want to share a myth, a story from India that is what popped into my head as I was contemplating this. Because the yogic tradition, the Bhakti yoga tradition, has kind of a culture of spiritual emergency, and the thought is that the story goes is that there were these women called the gopis, and they were humble milkmaids. They lived in a village named Vrindavan, and they just, for the most part, did what you would expect women who worked with cows would do. However, these particular women in this particular village were actually enlightened beings, that they had gone through many, many lifetimes as sages and rishis. They had learned all of the stories, and they had learned all of the teachings. They have embodied all of the teachings, and then they became just were living this simple life. And they did that because they were totally immersed in love. They were totally immersed in love and devotion of the Supreme. They had found that that was beyond all of the teachings, all of the wisdom, anything you could learn or know was just love of God, and particularly of Krishna. And so they were born into this life so that they could just play with God. This was the new thing, where they didn't have to take any teachings, or I've said that a dozen times. And they seemed quite ordinary until Krishna would play his flute. And when he would play his flute, they would hear the call, and they would become enraptured and mesmerized, and they would drop everything that they were doing. If they were in the bath, they would run out of the bath. There's stories of women whose makeup was half done, clothes on backwards, pots left on the stove, houses burning down. And this confused and worried a lot of people, not the least of which was their husbands, because their husbands, of course, thought that these women should be worshiping them because they were materialistic. They didn't think that they should be worshiping the divine. But they would leave everything material behind, and they would dance and cavort in the forest with the Supreme. And one of the things that they would say about them is that they would appear to be like typeset letters, right? So if you remember old typesetting letters, or even if you look at an old typewriter, that the letters would be backwards, but when they hit the paper, they hit just right, and that everything was actually right after all. And so I just sometimes think of the best case scenario of a spiritual emergency would be that we were all reborn as lovers of the divine. Right. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that today and a couple other things. Thanks for indulging me. I would love to, what I will do is I will introduce each of you, and then I will kind of ask you why this work is important to you, and where this, how you got to where you are in this work, and things of that nature. So Erica Siegal, welcome. Erica is the founder of Nest Harm Reduction. She's a licensed clinical social worker, psychedelic assisted psychotherapist, mentor, and supervisor to aspiring psychedelic professionals. Thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
Thanks. So will you just introduce yourself and tell us why this work is important to you?
Sure. Erica Siegal. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've been working in psychedelic research above ground for almost a decade now. I was also, from 2015 until right up until the pandemic, I was working in crisis mental health response at music festivals and events at Burning Man and Envision, and worked with the Zendo Project for many years. to really, in the best harm reduction practice I can find is to be able to meet people where they're at. And when they're going through their own psychedelic assisted spiritual emergency, I've been honored to sit with those people, sit with probably 1,000 people at this point, to see what they're going through and kind of identify patterns and archetypes and things like that. And so COVID kind of shut everything down for a couple of years, but we're back at it, and we'll be at a couple of events this summer and fall, and then obviously expanding from there. And that's really what brought me to this work, was like seeing people who are genuinely in crisis and in need, and kind of filling that gap.
Excellent. Thank you. Hope the Ethereal is a spiritual integration guide with a focus on long-term complex integration, reactivations, and spiritual crisis. Hope is the director of the psychospiritual program for Crossroads in Mexico and the program director for integration at the First World Bufo Alvarius Congress. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and be talking about this very complex and necessary topic. What brought me to this work? I was a decades-long psychonaut. I had a great affinity for being in altered states of consciousness. As I was approaching 40, I got the calling to sit more ceremonially and to start healing some of the trauma that was very, very buried. I was a functioning, walking adult trauma problem. And as that started to unfold, I was called to work with 5-MeO DMT. And while my initial introduction into 5-MeO was absolutely blissful, the following experiences really ripped the rug out from underneath my reality. And I began to see that I actually had no real identity. The trauma had created this chameleon. And once the chameleon, reality that I was attempting to live was removed, I didn't know who I was. And I found myself feeling very isolated and alone in that. And, this was about 8 or 9 years ago. There really wasn't any place online to talk about it. Groups hadn't really formed yet. I just really didn't know what to do with myself. I left my career. I left all my clients, big jobs, and dedicated myself to the medicine work and assisting other servers so that I could just be in the space constantly. It was the only thing that I knew was true, was the medicine space. And in that dedication was invited down to run the psychospiritual program at Crossroads, and in short order ended up running the entire program, the Ibogaine Detoxing 5-MeO program with the psychospiritual program. And then when I left Crossroads, it was time to really do some deep work on myself. Meanwhile, I admin a group on Facebook. We have about 7,000 members. In about 2015, 2016, we started to see a real wave of people harmed by 5-MeO facilitators and no real online or any type of support system. People that could speak that language of what is a reactivation, and I started to see people in the medical system being pathologized and put on medicines when we really just needed to address the spiritual side of what was happening first. So I became really dedicated to that behind the scenes. And that led me to being here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And then the reason that we are here together at all, this panel is the brainchild of Jasmine Virdi. Jasmine currently works for the independent publishing company, our dear friends at Synergetic Press. She's pursuing a master's in spirituality, consciousness, and transpersonal psychology at the Olive Trust. She's a volunteer for the Fireside Project and was recently included in the 40 under 40 outstanding BIPOC leaders in drug policy. Thanks for being here, Jasmine.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited that this panel came into fruition, and I feel like it's a really timely and important thing to talk about. Yeah, I mean, what brought me to the work? I think I'll speak about what brought me to this particular panel and angle in psychedelics. And for me, it's a really, similar to all of you, it's a really personal story. And in 2014, I had a very high dose psilocybin experience. And the whole thing was very kind of intentionally curated. And, I went into it with a deeper, I guess, awareness of psychedelic therapy. And also at the time, I'd been really exploring my spirituality through Hinduism and Buddhism and, all this meditative practice. But, that being said, like, I felt like none of the preparations that I undertook really could prepare me for the depth of the mystical experience that that I was launched into. And so, although the experience was a really blissful and ecstatic one, and kind of this complete dissolution of self into what, there's a Sanskrit saying tat tvamasi, like thou art that, there was no separation between me and the other. Coming out of that, I just found myself incredibly destabilized, but without really being aware of the fact that I was destabilized. I was launched into this place where I was maybe slightly manic. My life became a chain of synchronicities, and it was very kind of hard for me to separate what was, real externally from my inner experience. And similar to what Hope shared, at the time, there weren't really all these integration circles that there are online. And I felt like I was out there alone in the dark, even though I had friends to talk to about these things. It was a period of deep challenge and grappling. And it's very scary to feel like one is going crazy and losing a grasp of reality. But at the same time, there was a knowing in me that there was some kind of truth in all of this. And I spent a long time after that experience trying to really understand what had happened to me, and coming across the notion of spiritual emergency really helped me ground that experience and understand that there were other people that had similar experiences. And it kind of catalyzed my path in the psychedelic space. I'm someone that studied linguistics, and now I'm like on a completely different track. And so I volunteer for Fireside, and I think some of that work in harm reduction really comes from, having this experience and wanting to show up for others in that capacity.
Gorgeous, thank you. What a great bunch. What a great bunch you are. Can we just go into perhaps a definition of spiritual emergency and where the concept even comes from?
Yeah, I guess I can jump into that. So the concept of spiritual emergency was kind of, the term was coined by Stan and Christina Grof, Stanislav Grof's former wife and, late wife, I should say. Christina Grof had an experience of spiritual emergence that was triggered by, I think, actually giving birth. So triggered by childbirth. And she had a very destabilizing period in which, she was having all of these very, one, ecstatic, but two, scary experiences in which, she energetically didn't feel in control of her body. And so they developed this kind of concept around that. And I think it also relates to, Stanislav Grof is one of the co-founders, I should say, of the field of transpersonal psychology. And I think compared with kind of, conventional psychology, transpersonal psychology really kind of highlights and embodies more post-materialist approaches to consciousness, and gives more value to these states and the fact that learning can be found in them. And something that I will add is that psychologist called David Lukoff actually took this concept of spiritual emergency, but he made it kind of more accessible in the mainstream through like co-authoring a DSM-4 and 5 category called, spiritual and religious problem. And so, I think that's a way that might be spoken about in a more mainstream way, because I think, the term spiritual emergency is still kind of a fringe one in my experience, but maybe I can let Hope and Erica speak more to that too.
Hope, you want to go?
Well, I think, it's so multifaceted, right? As I've been thinking a lot about this topic, getting ready, the idea, and I think, Daniel, you brought this up on our chat about, it being an emerging, right? And what is emerging, right? It's hopefully on the others, it's an awakening, right? But there is a crisis part of it. So, and it's like breaking it down and looking at, whether someone is really in a psychological mental health place versus really having a spiritual experience that needs some context and guiding, and then hopefully, landing somewhere on the other side of it where they feel safe, and it can be a really long process. I think mine was like 5 years. I just call it 5 years of utter darkness, even though there was good moments of it, but it definitely was very personally very painful and dark for a very long time, but now I am at peace. I have a contentment in me that I never knew before. I didn't know it was possible. And it continues to kind of unfold as, I stay present with it. I made a comment yesterday to a friend that I recognized a certain behavior pattern. Is a decades long friend. And she goes, "Oh, I could have told you that." And I was like, yeah, well, I mean, you don't know it until you're able to see it for yourself. And I think that's part of, if you can stay calm in the crisis, and get the support, reach out and get with people that can speak the language, that it really can be a beautiful thing on the other side. And so crisis, it's an emergence and an awakening, and the crisis doesn't really need to be so intense, in the middle of it with the right help.
Yeah, and to build on what both of you were saying, the kind of like layman's definition of spiritual emergency is, an event that has catalyzed a shift in the way that you view the world, the way that you view your place in the world, the way that you view your connection to things. And so whether it's brought on by trauma or grief or psychedelics, it's a massive orientation shift that can be really ungrounding and disorienting and scary and beautiful for the person who is experiencing it and the people that are closest to them. Because all of a sudden, the person that you knew is no longer that person. There's been a shift, there's been a change, and it's very hard to orient yourself and orient the world when you're going through these kind of massive existential changes. And so I think, looking at a spiritual emergency from the mental health, the clinical mental health perspective, is, everybody is entitled to their beliefs and the way that they view the world. And is that having a negative impact on you, or a dangerous impact on you or your loved ones or your family members, and how to properly communicate through that. And I think we can learn a lot from indigenous approaches and Eastern medicine, way more than we can Western medicine, which is basically to cover it up with nets. And that's not really what we're trying to do here, especially with psychedelics and spiritual emergency.
So what are some of the, the problems with covering it up with meds, the problems with the Western view of spiritual emergency? And then how do we create more literacy? How do we reframe people who are maybe stuck in their ways when it comes to this sort of thing?
I think people are stuck in their ways because they have a lot of fear and shame. And the more that we can sit with that discomfort and sit with that fear when it comes to working with our clients or sitting with our friends, the easier the process gets. I think that there is a lot that the patriarchal Western medicine model like doesn't cover, this spiritual aspect, this the magic of the world is the way that I like to define it. It's like there are things that happen, signs that we see in the universe that aren't explained by science or medicine, especially when it comes to plant medicine and ayahuasca and 5-MeO and some other things. And to be able to like take that as a valid truth, I think is really challenging for a lot of medical professionals and people who are kind of trained in Western medicine styles.
Yeah, and kind of just adding to what Erica just shared, I think that, you know, as a culture, Western culture really privileges waking consciousness as the only state that you can kind of draw legitimate understanding from. And so I think like looking to Indigenous cultures, you know, like how can we find wisdom in our dreams? How can we find wisdom in non-ordinary states? And like, you know, those insights during those states, yeah, that they're real. They have real impacts and consequences in your life if you know, choose to pay attention to what they're signifying to you. And the same with a spiritual emergency or a period of spiritual emergence. I feel like it's an extended, you know, non-ordinary state in a way. And yeah, for me, during my own period of spiritual emergence, there were so many synchronicities. And I think in our culture, you know, we tend to dismiss those even as just kind of, yeah, by chance or something like that. It's not something necessarily meaningful. And so I think I would apply like a non-pathologizing approach to these states. I think that's a really important perspective to come from. Like, you know, what you're experiencing is okay, and it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you, you know. So I'd add that as well.
I think also too, you know, going back to this being a multifaceted topic, you know, everybody's spiritual emergence and experience is going to be completely different, you know, and in some few cases, it's going to be hearing of voices, it's going to be experiencing what we would call entities, not necessarily maleficent, but, you know, an other non-seen realm. And, you know, we're not really in a society here in the Western culture where we validate that outside of the structure of certain religions. And so that can lend itself to the isolation. And, you know, I really feel like if as a society, as we start to discuss the unseen world of spirits and energies without the context of it all being fearful or, you know, satanic or demonic or harmful. Not to say that there isn't an element that can be that way, but if we approach all of those experiences from the onset that it's bad, there's an underlying fear of the individual having, you know, what is happening to me? You know, I'm hearing things, I'm knowing things. And, you know, going back to just being able to discuss that that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be, it can also not be, you know, and it's really just trying to uncover what is actually happening with the individual and getting to the root of, you know, again, like Erica said, if the individual is, if their life is being disturbed in a way that is really harmful, then, you know, yeah, we're in kind of a crisis, but, you know, maybe it's just something that is emerging in that person, a latent gift that was not known about previously, you know, and that can be very disorienting. That's what happened with me. I started channeling in other languages uncontrollably, not on substances, in environments that it was not the right time or place for that to be happening. And my sanity was questioned. I was actually working with Erica in harm reduction when it was suggested that I might need to go to the tent. And the spirit that was speaking through me did not like that idea. It was like, oh, I need help. Like, not in that moment through the tent, through my coworkers, but it sent me on a journey where, I spent 10 months really trying to uncover, okay, what is going on here? And coming to terms with it. Now, whatever it is, 5-6 years later, I've really embraced that. And I have a handle on it now because of the individuals that were able to help me put some context around it, understand what was happening, the vernacular. And then now I feel more in control of when and where that can and cannot happen and how it happens. I wasn't able to turn it completely off, but, somebody might be able to tell me that one day. But I think, just trying to bring it more into this safe context of discussion, that just because it's happening doesn't mean it's bad. That helps people feel more safe.
Right. I like this idea a lot. And I guess since we're sharing our stories, my spiritual emergency, there was something very beneficial that was emerging, and it just seemed to be kind of shaking up all of the low grade coping mechanisms that sort of I was rounding up to call a personality, and that became very disorganized. And there's sort of that idea of, it was a bit of a dark night of the soul. I think they use quite a bit, but the thing about the dark night of the soul is that eventually the sun rises, and we're often left with something that's very, very beneficial. And so can we talk a little bit more about that, about how to support people so that it can be beneficial, how to frame it so that people can see perhaps that light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, I guess I can share. Well, from someone that's coming from like a more harm reduction background, speaking to people on the line who call Fireside Project, I think for me, well, one thing is just being really gentle about it. In my own, period of spiritual emergence, I had people come to me that were kind of like trying to, I don't know, take me out of that spiritual emergence. And I think there's a psychic process which needs to unfold. And I think letting the person go through what they need to go through is one thing, and holding space for that. And like Hope said, it could be a really long period of time. And so there's an element of patience which comes in there also. But patience and being gentle. And then I think also, language is really important. And I think different language will resonate with different people, but I think we're able to ascribe meaning to these things positively or negatively through the way we language them. And that's when taking a non-pathologizing approach is really helpful. If you language it in a way that, someone knows, okay, well, I'm not going crazy, I'm going to be okay. I think more positive meaning can come out of that experience. And, when Hope was sharing previously, I was reminded of a study that I read years ago. It was by a medical anthropologist. Her name's Tanya Lerman. Maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong, but it was a study looking at schizophrenics cross-culturally and how the nature of their voices that they heard, the nature of their auditory hallucinations. And, I think it was 20 somewhere in the States, 20 in India, and 20 in Africa. And I think what they found was the American population actually had a much worse experience, with the voices that they were hearing, because and they also used a lot of medical language around it, just kind of I'm crazy, this is really scary, and just really pathologizing it, versus I think in the Indian and African sample of the study, like, yes, there were still people who had really frightening voices, but at the same time, they saw them as a source of wisdom. And also, you know, some of them referred to them as like deceased family members. And, you know, it was like an extension of the community that they already belonged to, as opposed to something foreign populating their consciousness. And I just think that's really interesting in terms of, well, yeah, just supporting people and making meaning, you know, like what you say about the experience and what, how other people support you in that really makes a difference to the internal experience that you're having.
I also think that it's really important if you're working with somebody who is going through spiritual emergency, whether that's as a professional or as a peer, like to know your role in supporting people. And so, you know, I'm not here to challenge the belief systems of any of my clients. I'm here to give them space for their stories to be told. And so whatever the reality is, like, I'm not here to invalidate them. I'm here to align with them and to assist them in creating meaning and quality of life through whatever their decisions are. Obviously, in a harm reducing kind of capacity of, you know, I wouldn't tell anybody to actively like walk into traffic to prove that like God's protecting you. Like, right, there's a line between safety and like the reality that we currently live in versus the reality that maybe somebody's mental state is in.
Take off from the ground.
Right. If you're gonna fly, you take off from the ground. You don't go up high and jump, because you can fly either way. Safer to try it from the ground. And so I think that's, you know, I love looking at indigenous models and kind of like ancient models of working with people who are hearing voices, or working with people who might be channels for the dead, or channels for ancestors to come through to like be the storytellers, versus like there's something wrong with you, you need to be fixed. And I think that in America it's a really massive challenge because nobody here wants to be labeled crazy. Nobody here wants to get their rights taken away. And as people are going through spiritual emergencies and integrating, you know, high dose psychedelic experiences as well, I think there's a lot of fear and shame about sharing what's actually going on with them. And so the safer we can make it as practitioners and support people and peers and professionals, it's like our job to remove our judgment from those situations and to really kind of align with the person who we're of service to.
Yeah, and I'd like to piggyback on that. Something else that we can be doing is trying to reach out to as many of these underground medicine, psychedelic medicine facilitators, and teaching them about full consent. You know, individuals oftentimes are, you know, when they find their way to me, they didn't know, they felt like no one told them that these events could occur. You know, they got the sunny side of the experience explanation, but not the potential downside. So I think that, you know, as a psychedelic community, we need to start really discussing these as real and potential outcomes, and individuals need to go into these experiences, like I said, in full consent that, you know, this could happen to you. And are you prepared for that? Because if you are not in a place where you can afford, and I don't mean that financially, but in every other aspect, if you cannot afford for the rug of your life to be ripped up from underneath you, you know, it might not be the right time to be going on that journey. And along those lines, we see a lot of peer coercion. I can't tell you how many individuals that end up finding their way to me for aftercare who were, coerced by a facilitator. They had paid a deposit. They were told, oh, you already paid your deposit, but they were getting a no, but they weren't listening to their no. Their friend insisted it was the best thing ever that was going to happen to them, and yeah, the best friend had a really amazing experience, but this person's life is falling apart. They're losing their jobs and their marriages and their housing. And, when the rug gets removed, we really don't have the social safety nets in this country to support these. Again, they end up in the medical model. And so I think just going back to education and getting the word out that, these things can be really amazing and can chart neural pathways, and, you can be better at your job, and you could also not be able to do your job. Having a balanced discussion around psychedelia is very important.
Yeah, I'd also just like to add, and it's in line with both of these things, is that, through my experience working volunteering at Fireside, there's so many people that call up, and there's a sense of, like you mentioned, Erica, like fear and shame around these experiences. And, I think like in the mainstream media, articles in New York Times and beyond, there's a big focus on like, oh, curing depression and anxiety, and like, it's all of the benefits, as you mentioned, Hope. And like, yes, of course, psychedelics are that and so much more, but like, we have a responsibility as a community to kind of hold space and educate around the kind of flip side of that. And that, healing as a process is messy, and that's okay. But I think, like, I've realized in my conversations that some of this fear and shame, also comes from feeling like, participants or individuals' journeys feel like they did something wrong, or there's something wrong with them, that they've taken the substance with the expectation that they will be healed, and now they feel worse. And that, I get calls and they're like, what's wrong with me? What did I do wrong? Or like, why is this not working on me? So I think like we have responsibility to educate around it,
100%.
And so now that we have the opportunity to educate, we've got, we've got this many people in the room, and who knows how many people will watch this. And let's say we're going to there's a couple of different ways to educate, I feel like. Let's say, one of them is to maybe just put a bug in the ear of somebody who might have a spiritual emergency in the future, and they think back to us and they're like, oh, this is what I should do. And then there's an idea for maybe people who have friends, who are having a spiritual emergency. And then maybe there are therapists or clinicians who are in the room. And so so let's start first with the individual. Let's say, you're the person and you have had one, you're in the middle of one, you might have one in the future. What do we tell those people to do? How do they take care of themselves? And when is it time to look for outside help?
So I would say, like, step one is like, find a trusted person who you can talk about what's going on with you, and say like, this might not all make sense right now, but I need to have somebody bear witness to what my experience is. And so just like, what Jazz was saying a little bit earlier about psychedelics, and like, all these positive benefits, and it's in the New York Times, and it's in Town and Country and Good Housekeeping now, and all of this different stuff, is like, there's no magic pill. Like, the magic pill is actually like community and integration and like doing it together. And so I think sometimes spiritual emergencies will manifest, and the person who's experiencing them will isolate and not tell people what's actually happening with them. And so I would say that, step one is find somebody, even if you're like not in a spiritual emergency right now. find that person who's like, hey, if I'm ever going through something weird, can I come to you just to be able to like offload or get reflection? I think I've seen so much harm done in the psychedelic communities from facilitators and practitioners when they haven't done informed consent. And like my big red flag is like, as soon as you start working with somebody and somebody who's like, don't tell anybody this is what we're doing, is like my first red flag. Because you should be informed. You should be like, oh, hey, this is what's happening. And does this sound right to you? When practitioners start to isolate you away from your community, it's like the first like big warning sign that there's potential for abuse and harm. And so I really think that for anybody who's going through it is to find a trusted person who you feel like you can go to, who kind of knows what your boundaries are, and inform them before you're in crisis. Hey, you're my go-to person. Like if I'm feeling weird, are you okay with that? And make that like not everybody is available for you 24 hours a day. And so maybe it's like, 3 or 4 friends that you can send a text to saying, hey, I'm going through some stuff. Does anybody have a moment? And then you return that favor to that other person. And it becomes like community healing. And so that's kind of like my biggest advice would be to find somebody who you trust, who can let you know when the line crosses to being unsafe.
I'll add then the next steps I would say would be to get in touch with some self-care, whatever that might look like. Grounding activities, being in nature, putting your feet in the sand or on the earth, just staring up at the trees, deep breathing, not too deep because you can get re-triggered, but just, calm, long, slow breaths. Sometimes hot baths were one of my saviors, salt baths. Every single night I'd light a candle, I'd get in a salt bath. I'd write down kind of my thoughts before I went to sleep so that my dream state felt a little clearer. So journaling, making some changes to routines, taking a good hard look at maybe external triggers in your life. If there's a person at work that maybe likes to talk about topics that are, not feeling safe, just kind of becoming very aware of your environment, who's around you, and making the necessary steps to, get yourself into where you can feel safe with what you're experiencing. Sometimes our family members are weighing in, again, going back to the safe person, one thing that I like to tell a lot of people after, psychedelic experiences that are very powerful is you were just handed a nugget of gold. And just like if you were really handed a piece of gold, you wouldn't tell everyone about it. You would really stop and think about who can handle that information and hold that. And looking at your experience as a precious thing to be kind of, guarded and protected while you go through it is really important. And not sharing it, again, going back to, finding the safe person, but even further than that, recognizing who isn't safe, who is going to project their idea onto you. Oh, you're just doing this, or this is what's happening. And someone, that person is not necessarily the safe person. It needs to be someone who's listening and just holding a neutral space to you. We find people that have deep rooted religious backgrounds, sometimes have a lot of internal conflict going on about everything that they thought they believed versus what they're believing. I found books to be immensely helpful. There are a lot of really The Untethered Soul, A New Earth. There are a lot of, great books that can just help you, just separate from the world for a moment and kind of just go into yourself. And I think the more time that an individual can spend alone, not isolating, but in thoughtful, meditative, connection with what is actually unfolding for them, can be very, very helpful. I usually tell people that since I work with mostly 5-MeO and extreme reactivations and some people who have mental health issues that got triggered off by psychedelics, I usually give them about a 3 to 4 week, if things don't become somewhat manageable in their lives, where yes, this is still going on, but you're okay. You can state that you're feeling okay in about a 3 to 4 week timeline and say, okay, you're having a spiritual crisis and this is manageable. But if they are in extreme distress over a 3 to 4 week period, I recommend outside medical professional help. And also we need to destigmatize pharmaceuticals at that stage. I think a lot of people that get into a spiritual crisis, they don't have the support system, the facilitator's no longer there for them, especially with 5-MeO, they end up in the ER and they're on meds immediately. I don't see anything personally wrong with medication if that is warranted and necessary. We need to be able to have a full conversation about, does that make sense? And when does it make sense? Not the first go-to, but some people might really need to end up with a little bit of Valium, just so that their lives don't fall apart.
And let me reiterate that from the mental health professional side of things. Sleep is really important. And oftentimes in people who are experiencing spiritual emergencies haven't slept in days. And there's like our physical system is not meant to do that. And we start getting more delusions, more somatic symptoms, opens sensitivity, things like that. Like, if you need to sleep and you can't sleep, like that's exactly when Western meds should be coming into play. Because once you get the sleep and you get the reset, what a lot of people are scared of getting, like mental health hospitalization in California. It's called the 5150, because they think that is going to kind of follow them around forever or means something more than it actually means. But really, it's like gotten to the point where like you just need somebody to watch you for 3 or 4 days as you start to regulate back into this version of reality, instead of having these veils kind of layered over each other that happens often in spiritual emergencies. And so it's really about like getting your brain and your body the sleep it needs and the observation, so you don't hurt yourself when you've been up for 4, 5, 6 days in a row.
I also would like to give a big shout out to sleep, and a lot of props to root vegetables. Just like clean grounding food and proper sleep is, it's not glamorous, but it seems to do the trick.
Yeah.
We have maybe time. Somebody has asked, I feel like we're just getting started. This should be 5 hours. If you guys want to do a 5-hour version of this, let me know. We'll put it together. Where do we continue to find resources on this? Where can we become more informed about spiritual emergencies?
I would say there's a great book by Stan and Christina Grof called The Stormy Search for the Self. I think that one's, it reads better for me personally than Spiritual Emergency. They also have that book, but I really like this one because I think it speaks to people who are actually undergoing that experience a little bit more. And I could pop an article in the chat that I also wrote about spiritual emergency, but it is just like scratching the surface of a very, very deep topic, but it can give a holistic view. And I think there's also like some groups. I think the Spiritual Emergence Network has, I think you can reach out to them if you're wanting to get involved. And I think, I need to look into it, but they do have some trainings also around, how to show up and peer support for people undergoing spiritual emergence. It looked like Erica had something to add too.
I was like, not to shamelessly self-promote, but I'll shamelessly self-promote. Nest, the company that I founded in 2019, offers community consultation, mediation, and psychotherapy services to people in California and Colorado. And so if it's like hey, I just want to I don't want to sign up to be your patient, but can I have 30 minutes of your time to talk through what's going through? I have a whole staff of people that address that. I would also say, reach out to Fireside, which I think is a great resource of being able to be I'm going through this thing. It's psychedelic in nature or spiritual in nature, and I don't know who to talk to. Being able to go there, and they should be able to link you to resources as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great stuff. And then also I want to note that if you're interested in supporting friends or supporting people in altered states, Erica has a class on the TAM website that doesn't get a lot of traction, right? Remember you did that forever ago.
I did a 5-hour talk for you.
You did a 5-hour talk, and people really, really enjoyed it. And I see that people who signed up for it are watching it, but we haven't sold an additional copy since.
Okay, so if you're on this and you want more information, sign up for my class.
Sign up for your class.
Sign up for my class. Nest is also doing a 2-day conference about psychedelics and ethics in November. That's unannounced yet. You guys are the first ones to hear about it.
I heard it here first. That's amazing. Is it going to be in California?
It will be in Palm Springs.
Nice.
Yeah, Palm Springs in November. We have a whole bunch of ethicists coming in. We also are integrating some sex educators in who are experts in consent and boundaries, because the best thing that we can do to learn as an emerging community is to look at the industries that have been doing this much longer than we have, and how are they navigating and negotiating this. And so it's kind of going to be a crossover between psychedelic ethics, informed consent, and boundaries for when that comes up. And so it'll be altered states in all of their forms, including BDSM and kink.
Sure. We were talking about Dan Savage earlier today.
Nice.
And we are, and so thank you for coming, Hope, Jasmine, Erica. I really appreciate it. If you feel like chatting more, there's a Discord channel, and then sometimes people talk a little bit afterwards. I'll actually tinyurl.com Tam Jam Chat if you guys want to go in there and chat. And speaking of boundaries and sexual ethics and healing, that kind of stuff, that's what's coming up next. Is our next talk is on spiritual emergency, sexual trauma and healing, psychedelics. So again, Hope, Jasmine, Erica, thank you all. Oh yeah, reach out to these people, reach out to Hope. Many blessings, much love.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you for this. This was wonderful.
Thanks, Hope and Jazz. I look forward to
thank you, everyone.